Yeah, so Chris, thanks so much, and thanks to the study GRC Mafia that I see is rabid at this point. So I'm happy to be here. I know Marissa did a presentation probably a couple months ago at this point, and I was able to listen to it, and she did a great job. But I figured, why not have somebody from HITRUST themselves come out here and kind of give you a peek behind the curtain. So I'm going to go over HITRUST at a really high level, but I'm also going to dive deep somewhat into the weeds in some areas just to give you an idea of what HITRUST is, how the assessments work, the rigor that's built into them, the relevancy of it, so on and so forth. But before I jump into that, I just want to give everybody a little bit of a background on me. I've been with HITRUST for about 3 years at this point, but before that, I've been working with the framework so almost 12 years at this point. So really familiar with that, but also did a lot of work against 853, some ISO work, lots of HIPAA work because I worked for some firms that were specialized in healthcare. I've worked at some health systems in the past. But beyond that, I have a Department of Defense background, spent about 20 years in the United States Army, started off a really cool tanker, used to roll around on the Abrams tank in Iraq. Then they started throwing me out of airplanes, and then ultimately they made me an IT guy, which, probably what led to my security career. So that's me in a nutshell, and I offer that because sometimes I have a tendency to use, military acronyms and jargon. So if I say anything or if I use an acronym that you don't understand, feel free to call me on it, and I will explain it. But also it's really shaped my perspective on a lot of things that I feel passionate about and have perspective on. So HITRUST has been around for 17 plus years at this point, and there's a lot of misconceptions about HITRUST just generally, and I'll name a few, and if these resonate with you, feel free to put it into the chat. Yep, Ryan, I thought that, or I heard that all the time. One of the common misconceptions is that HITRUST is only for healthcare, and that's not true. And I'll get into some of the reasons why in the future, but the framework has been industry agnostic since about 2018. Second common misconception is that HITRUST is really, really expensive. And if you compare it to, a $2,000 to $5,000 SOC 2, then yeah, you probably would think it's expensive, but the quality of that $2,000 to $5,000 SOC 2 kind of pales in comparison. So you kind of get what you pay for. And we can get into the cost of HITRUST, although I don't have it in this brief right now. I'm happy to talk about that. If there's other common misconceptions or things that you have an opinion on around HITRUST, feel free to throw out the hard questions. If there's something that pops up in the middle, even though Chris told me save Q&A to the end, I may answer those questions. So feel free to throw them in there as the presentation is moving along. So HITRUST was born, like I said, in 2007. It was designed to solve what I call the HIPAA problem. So HIPAA, when it was signed into law in 96 and then enacted in the early 2000s, left healthcare organizations with more questions than they had answers to when it came to what the heck HIPAA wanted them to do through the lens of the security rule and the privacy rule and the safeguards within it. So our co-founder, along with several other industry stakeholders, came together and built this prescriptive framework in order to answer those questions and tell folks and tell organizations, in a granular way, how to implement these controls. Because, HIPAA, and I'm going to be really general right here, will say something like, you must have passwords, or you must have password complexity. But what should the complexity consist of? So on and so forth. So that was the catalyst for the framework all those years ago, but we have dramatically evolved and changed and improved, in my opinion, since that time. And I just wanted to paint a picture here of all the things that go into a HITRUST assessment, whether you're the one being assessed or you're the one who is consuming the end report. There is multiple different pillars and foundational elements of that assessment, and we're going to dig into a bunch of this, but it's very layered, almost like an onion. It will make you cry depending on the complexity of the assessments, but there's so much that we can uncover here. So I'm going to start with kind of what we feel is the difference maker. For us, we focus on the relevancy of our controls, and I'll explain what that means. But we also feel really, really passionately about the assurance methodology and the assurance program to include quality as a mechanism or a part of that full-fledged program / methodology. And we recently started writing a report annually. And Chris, if you can throw the link that I put into the chat, the trust report link, we released it for the first time last year, and then we just released it back in February of this year. And some pretty incredible metrics came out of that based on our population of organizations. Is we saw in 2024 that only 0.59% of organizations had a breach within the HITRUST certified environment. Said differently, less than 1% of HITRUST certified environments suffered a breach in 2024. And if you couple that or compare it to what we're seeing, and the statistics vary, I see everything from 40% of organizations, I see as high as 60, I've seen even higher, but I'm going to stay in that 40 to 60% range, have suffered a breach in the last 12 months. I think it's pretty compelling that we're less than 1% compared to the industry average. And I'm definitely going to nerd out on why that is and what goes into that. But we actually have 100% of the addressable TTPs and mitigations for the MITRE ATT&CK covered in our 3 assessments. I believe Marissa talked about the 3 assessments. If not, I'm going to get into that. I'll talk you through what all those look like. But we also, even though many times where assessments are kind of point in time, we feel that we're somewhat forward-looking in the way that we have built the entire program, not only from the way that we craft the maturity levels within the assessments, but the fact that we have recertification cycles and we require our customers, before they're certified, to write corrective action plans. And if you look at that bottom statistic, for repeat HITRUST certified customers, there were 54% fewer corrective action plans than in the previous year. So when you think about continuous improvement through the lens of potentially continuous monitoring, we're serving as a forcing function in order to deliver that and ensure that that's in place. All right, so I'm going to take this in buckets, if you will, right? I'm going to start with the framework. As I mentioned, it was built in 2007. We update our framework at minimum twice a year. And if you look at other standards, regulations, and/or frameworks, that frequency isn't happening. ISO 27001, the current version is 2022. Before that, it was 2013. So there was a 9-year gap between updates to the controls within ISO 27001. And if you think about the things from an attack perspective or a malicious actor perspective, and from a technology perspective, 9 years is a really, really long time. Generative AI did not exist 9 years ago. Other versions of AI did, but not the way that we're seeing it today. So the way that technology evolves, we feel that we need to maintain our framework at a much more consistent basis. We're also we consider ourselves a harmonizer or a framework of frameworks. So as our recent version 11.5, we are mapped to 61 what we call authoritative sources. So think about standards, regulations, or frameworks, and I listed a few there. So our whole premise is we don't feel that it makes sense in any world for an organization that may be in a multi-reporting or multi-regulated environment where they need to do separate assessments to satisfy all of their requirements. especially when you consider most frameworks have a pretty considerable amount of overlap. Why should somebody have to pay multiple times to cover the same controls? And teams internal to the organization shouldn't have to provide the same evidence over and over and over and over again. So what we're really trying to do is reduce that burden, reduce that redundancy, increase the efficiency for teams internal to an organization to meet all of their requirements, but do it in a smart way. So HITRUST as an organization, we don't do any assessments. We are the governing body over our framework, and we're the certification authority over the assessments built on the framework. We actually require that an independent external assessor or audit firm, think about professional service firms, think about audit firms, CPA firms, if you will, do the work of do the validation work and do the testing within the environment. And we don't just let anybody willy-nilly do this type of work. There's actually a process that they have to go through, much like if you're familiar with FedRAMP, the 3 PAOs, there's a lot of requirements that the 3 PAOs have to go through in order to be a 3 PAO. Well, we have a similar program. So they have to submit an application to us. As a part of that application, they have to give a background on all of the auditors or all of the analysts on the team to include, their relevant IT audit experience. Now, knowing the way IT audit has churn and turnover, we don't really focus on the ground level analysts as much as we look at the leadership team and have their experience from an IT audit perspective, but we do expect the analysts to have experience doing these types of audits. And one of the things that we really focus on are the policies and procedures for that entity around ethics and integrity, right? Because they're supposed to be an independent entity, independent organization, an unbiased organization in this ecosystem. So we want to make sure that they have the right culture to do this type of work. And truth be told, we've actually kicked external assessors, these firms, out of the program for ethics and integrity violations. So we are regulating that environment. Unlike, and again, I'm just drawing comparisons, I'm not throwing anything else under the bus, but unlike ISO or SOC or anything like that, there really is no feedback loop other than the market responding to a really bad auditor. So we are deliberate in that effort. As an audit firm, they have minimum requirements. So they have to have a minimum of 5 people on staff that have attended and passed our certification course, the CCSFP, the Certified CSF Practitioner. I failed to mention that our framework is called the HITRUST CSF. What that used to stand for was the Common Security Framework, but many moons ago, we added a privacy domain, so we just shortened it to the CSF, and that's officially what it's called now. So those 5 CCSFPs must be on staff at all times, and it's a 3-year certification cycle. So they get their initial certification, and then they have to do refreshers for the next 2 years before they have to recertify again. So we're constantly kind of putting our thumb on them and retraining them and making sure that they understand what the expectations are to get these assessments done. On top of that, and I'm going to get to in a future slide why we did this, we actually require 2 CHQPs. These are quality professionals that we've also trained and certified to do quality work on the assessment prior to submission to HITRUST. They have to sign an agreement with us, maintaining that they're going to follow all the rules or be subject to, whether it be something punitive or what have you, they are legally obligated to do these assessments appropriately according to our rules and with ethics and integrity. Just a quick data point, and this one's actually from our 2024 trust report, but in 2023, We provided over 37,000 training hours through our academy, training folks like external assessors, or sometimes it's folks who are within the organizations being certified, but we're constantly training folks on the methodology and what we're trying to do. And I think it's important to point out that you look at the graphic on this slide, 74% of the hours spent on an assessment were done by a CCSFP. So we don't require all the hours to be done by a CCSFP. Actually, the minimum requirement is 50 hours. So half of the testing and validation has to be done by a CCSFP, but you can see that our external assessors have taken to heart the training and the rigor, if you will, that we put into these assessments, or we're forcing them to put into these assessments, that they want their trained and authorized staff members to do the work. All right, so we talked about the framework, we talked about the external assessors, which is about 120 of those external assessor firms. So it's not just a small pool that can drive up the prices. There is a lot of competition there to make sure that the prices are right size. But again, we can talk about that in the Q&A if anybody's curious. The assessments themselves, there's 3 of them. We have our R2, which stands for risk-based 2-year. If any of you are familiar with HITRUST, this is the assessment that most people associate with us. This was just called the HITRUST Validated Assessment up until about 3 years ago. This, I would call a significant emotional event. This is not for the faint of heart. The average size assessment for an R2 in 2024 is 379 controls. So not a small assessment. And I'll get into this in more detail in a future slide, but those 379 controls at a minimum have to be tested based on 3 levels of maturity. So when you do the math, the amount of testing and validation work that goes into that assessment is not small. And we actually require evidence at every maturity level. So this is not a yes/no assessment. This is a trust but verify assessment. And in my former life of doing high trust assessments, my customers against an R2 would generate 800 to 1,000 pieces of evidence and or artifacts to support the scores for the assessment and the validation. The reason why the R2 is called risk-based is because you tailor this assessment based on your organizational profile. And if you are considered, by HITRUST's opinion, to be a more risky organization, the requirements within the assessment, the controls within the assessment actually increase, or they get more rigorous. They're more demanding of you, if you will. The second assessment is called the I1, and that stands for implemented 1 year. So it's a 1-year certification, and it's focused on just implementation of controls. Now, that's not to say that policies and procedures aren't considered in that assessment, because sometimes policies and procedures are the implemented control. Think about disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans. That plan itself is the implemented control. The smallest assessment we have is the E1. That stands for Essentials 1 Year. 44 controls, and it is the bare minimum. This is the floor. What I tell folks is, if you're not doing these 44 things, you need to rethink your life, because you are inviting headache and heartache into it in the very near future from an incident/breach perspective. This is the 44 things, regardless of what industry you're in, what risk you present. These are the things you need to be doing. The I1, it's on the slide, 182 controls. Those are leading security practices. So it's a balance between the R2 and the E1, but it's the things that really mature organizations should be having in place. And I skipped over the first bullet, but to me, as a former, really cool security guy, now talking head, that first bullet is what I think makes us really different. We actually base our controls off threat intelligence data, not because we're sitting in a room with really big-brained people thinking that we're the smartest people on earth saying that these are the controls that matter. Yeah. We are actually ingesting threat data and letting the data tell us what controls matter, because the bad guys and gals have a say. Why not listen to them and have them tell us what matters from an exploit perspective? So we're ingesting that threat data on a quarterly basis. And as the previous slide mentioned, we are mapping that and bouncing it off the MITRE ATT&CK framework, looking at all the TTPs, and then the related mitigation recommendations from MITRE. And we bounce that off of primarily the E1 and the I1, and I'll explain why just those two in a second. And if we identify either an element of an existing control that is insufficient or missing, we change the control. If we find that a control is just flat out missing, we add that to protect all future assessments against that control moving forward. So when you think about the relevancy of the controls, they're about as near real time as you possibly can get. They're based off intelligence of what's happening in the wild as of 90 days ago. So to me, that's the sex appeal. That's the thing that gets me excited about why HITRUST works and why that 0.59% is what it is because we're actually not just doing assessments for the sake of looking at all the controls in 853. We're focusing organizations on the controls that matter, and we're committed to doing this. I actually heard recently that we're going to start doing this on a monthly basis. And you may be wondering, well, you're shifting the goalpost on organizations looking to get certified, and they have the option to take the new controls, or they can just continue to pursue where they're at. But when they recertify again, they are forced to take on those new controls. So it's not really shifting the goalpost. We give them options. One thing I want to point out is, when I say 44 controls in the E1, 182 controls in the I1, on average 379 for the R2, we built our controls really on the elements of the controls and not the control statements themselves. So within the E1, there's 127 elements. So think about 127 different checks and tests and things an organization has to demonstrate that they have maturity against, and it's scaled, right? So just because you can say that you have MFA in your environment on a yes/no questionnaire, but it's actually not scaled to privileged users, or it's not scaled to all the systems within your environment. All of that is taken into account with a HITRUST assessment. The I1 has 639 elements, and then, as you may guess, because there's a variance or the ability for the R2 to be tailored, the elements. Actually, I think the last number I heard, somewhere near 5,000 different elements that are checked during an R2 assessment. That's why I call it a significant emotional event. All right, so we talked about the framework. We talked about the fact that HITRUST doesn't do any assessments, doesn't do any testing or validation. Let's get into the validation. We have an entire handbook, and Chris, if you can put that into the chat, that tells our external assessors, publicly available. Any one of you can read this at your leisure, maybe when you're really bored, because it is pretty comprehensive, that tells the assessors exactly what they need to do. So the things that I'm going to run through right now is just scratching the surface. It's not even all the things that we tell them that they have to do and all the considerations and how the assessment needs to be conducted. I'm just hitting the wave tops here. We actually allow these external assessor firms the ability to do readiness work and validation. Now you're like, holy crap, independence. There's an independence issue here. We separate that at the executive level. So the team that does the readiness work cannot do the validation work. And those two teams need to be separated at the executive level of that organization. Now, really passionate people may say, well, there's still, potential for independence. But when I get into my QA spiel, I'm hoping that will ease some of your concerns. The controls have to be implemented for 90 days prior to testing. Policies and procedures, 60 days. So it is not possible for an auditor to come in, identify a gap, tell the customer there's this gap, and the next day the gap is filled and they say, yep, you're good to go, pass. They have to be able to demonstrate that this control has been implemented and functioning for a minimum of 90 days before it can be tested. Same thing with policies and procedures. So being able to, throw things together last minute is not something that happens in the HITRUST world. In fact, when you think about how long it takes an organization to get HITRUST certified, obviously it depends on which assessment they choose, but most organizations do months and months and months of remediation work in order to be prepared for the validation because we have this rule in place. All testing and field work must be completed within a 90-day window of submission to HITRUST. Now, most of the evidence is going to be collected in that 90-day window, but for certain controls that may be operating at a frequency that would exceed the 90 days, think about an annual test or a quarterly test or what have you, though that evidence can be collected outside the field work period, but everything has to be tested within the field work period. As I mentioned, 50% of the testing hours must be conducted by a CCSFP. We don't allow the external assessors to write the reports. We write the reports. But as a part of the submission to us, which happens in our SaaS-based platform called MyCSF, they not only have to score the organization at the maturity levels relevant to that assessment. Like I said, for the R2, there's technically 5 maturity levels. 3 are required. The other 2, they can opt in or out of. For the E1 and the I1, it's 1 maturity level, but they have to not only score the customer for each requirement at each maturity level, but they have to add commentary on how the test was performed, what was the outcome, what were the exceptions, and they have to provide evidence to support the testing and the narrative, if you will. As a part of the assessment, we require them to build a test plan and generate working papers. So they have to tell us how they plan on testing the environment, and then they have to tell us how they tested each requirement and the outcome of that testing. And it's based off of a population size. So if there are, 250 endpoints in the environment, and we tell them according to our testing methodology that they have to sample at least 10% of them, they're going to sample 25 endpoints within the scoped environment to ensure that that scale happens. It tells the sampling methodology, whether it was deliberate, whether it was random, whatever it may be. There's a couple different options all in the handbook that they can utilize. And they have to, and I probably already have said this a couple times, they have to collect the evidence. They can't just talk to the customer and say, hey, are you doing X, Y, or Z? And the customers say yes. They can do that, but then they're going to follow up and say, please show me the evidence. And that is honestly the hardest part of what HITRUST is doing, in that most people are not used to providing the level of evidence in the way that we tell them, because we actually tell them that there needs to be a date timestamp of when the evidence was generated and when it was collected. We want to know it was collected in the right time period. We also want to know that it is a piece of evidence that's still relevant. If they collected a piece of evidence for a daily control, but it's 15 months old, that doesn't fly. It has to be relevant. So for a daily control, we're going to want to see 30 days worth of that control functioning and in place. I mentioned R2 is based on a 5x5 maturity model. So there's 5 levels of maturity. Is there a policy that governs this control? Is there a process that tells people how to implement and manage the control? Is the control implemented? Is the control's effectiveness being measured? And based on that measurement, are you managing that control? Meaning, are you taking the output of the measurements and then rolling it back into one of the first 3, whatever the reason why it wasn't operating effectively? They have to prove that. And then our scoring is based on 5 levels of scoring. Think 0 to 125% increments. So when you think about the granularity of scoring, it's better than no exceptions or pass, fail. It actually gives the consumer of the report a little bit more to go off of from a, how mature is this control within the environment. Mentioned the test plan. Those test plans, when I was an external assessor, were really annoying to generate because there's a ton of information in there. We require a timesheet to be submitted. So when I talk about 74% of those testing hours being done by a certified CSF practitioner, that's where that comes from. Prior to submission to HITRUST, if there are any gaps in controls required for certification, they have to write a corrective action plan. So it's not just, oh, there's a gap here, everybody moves on. We want to know what's your plan to close this gap in the future. So from a scoring perspective, that's the gaps are determined based on the score. So to get certified, you need to score over a 71 at the domain level. So there's 19 domains within our framework. All of the controls in the assessment fall within one of those domains, and it's a roll-up score at the domain level. So you could not be really mature on one control, but you're mature in everything else in that domain, and you can still get certified. So there's flexibility in the framework. It's not as rigid as it may seem like on the surface, but you're going to be required to write a corrective action plan. And we actually require for the R2 at the interim assessments that you demonstrate, or the external assessor can verify that you're making meaningful progress on closing those caps. So I mentioned on a previous slide that there's 54% fewer caps for repeat HITRUST certified customers. That's because we are forcing them to do that, honestly. Excuse me. All right. Want to point out the graph on the right because I think this is pretty compelling. And when I talk to TPRM teams about the amount of time that they're spending doing due diligence on their vendors, I usually ask, are you spending an hour per vendor reading the answers to their questions for your questionnaire, or reading their SOC 2 or their HITRUST or whatever? Are you spending 10 hours? Are you spending 50 hours? What's the average? And the highest I've ever heard is 40 hours per vendor. They're spending 40 hours per vendor. It's not too bad. They must have a lot of analysts and they can spend a lot of time, or they have only a handful of vendors that they can spend that much time. The average number of hours spent on a HITRUST assessment is on this graph. So the E1, 101 hours, 44 controls, 101 hours. The I1, 306 hours, and for the R2, 492. So when you look at, on the high side, a TPRM analyst spending 40 hours with one vendor compared to nearly 500, the level of rigor and the depth that's being performed in this assessment overshadows a questionnaire or whatever their process may be. So relying on a HITRUST report, at least for me, and I'm biased, but I'm biased for good reason. I've helped organizations for years achieve this certification, so I've seen firsthand that it works. It would leave me with a much higher level of comfort that what's in that report is actually representative of what's happening within the environment. All right, so I told you that the threat-based control selection is one thing that gets me really, really excited. Our submission and QA process is the other thing that gets me really, really excited. So if you look at, let's take NIST, for example. If I'm a professional service firm, a consulting firm, and someone asks me to do an 853 assessments of their environment, ultimately, I'm QAing my own work. I'm doing the testing, I'm writing a report. Maybe there's a second person who's going to read the report, but they're likely going to read the report for grammar, for things like that. They're not going to be reviewing your testing. Now, I know that's a broad generalization, but bear with me. For something like a SOC 2, there's in theory 2 levels of quality assurance. There's a management assertion, a management representation letter that the organization being assessed has to sign that basically says, we were ethical, we provided factual evidence, we didn't fabricate anything, so on and so forth. Then you have the CPA who signs off on the report. And that's kind of where it ends. I mean, AICPA does have a peer review process, but it's not comprehensive. It's the actual peer reviews. It's a flawed system. You hire the other CPA firm to come in and do your peer review. So you're paying the person who is supposed to tell you whether you're doing something right or wrong. And the sheer number of peer reviews that are happening is, I think it's something like 3%. It's not happening all that frequently. FedRAMP is a little bit different. Things like that are different. They're a little more comprehensive. So there's multiple layers for a FedRAMP or a GovRAMP because you have the third party, you have the 3PAO that's doing the assessment, then it goes to the PMO or it goes to the agency itself, and they're doing the review as well. For HITRUST, there's 6 plus levels of quality assurance. So like the SOC 2, we require a management assertion. So the management team at that organization has to assert that everything that happened during the assessment was on the up and up. There wasn't any issue. They didn't fabricate anything. Then you also have the individual analysts, those CCSFPs, who have to sign off that they did the testing and they have to sign off that it was done kind of on the up and up. We then require an executive sponsor for that external assessor to review the report or the outcome of not the report, but the outcome of the assessment, all of the information that went into it, typically in our tool, MyCSF. We also require that certified QA professional does a full review of the assessment. So they're actually digging into the evidence and making sure that the testing matches the evidence and vice versa, and matches the test plan and matches the working paper, so on and so forth. So the analyst, the QA professional, and the executive sponsor, all at the external assessor firm, have to sign off on the assessment, and that's a part of the submission to us. Upon submission to us, we run automation against that assessment looking for quality issues. It's about 250 checks that get run against that assessment before a human on the HITRUST side ever picks it up. If we find too many quality issues, we reject the assessment. And in 2024, we rejected 21.5% of assessments. That doesn't mean they didn't eventually get certified, but we kicked it back to the external assessor and to the customer and said, go fix this because there's things that are wrong here. NIST isn't doing that because NIST doesn't do assessments, but even people who are utilizing, whether it be the CSF or 853 or 171 or whatever flavor of NIST you want to do, they're not doing that work. CPA firms are not doing that. The AICPA is not doing that. ISO is not doing that. So we're actually rejecting things up front who don't meet muster. All right, for everybody else that's not in the 21.5%, gets through our automated checks. We have a quality analyst review the assessment. And they're doing a couple things. They're checking that the testing and the evidence support the scoring and so on and so forth. But what they're actually doing more of is checking the checker. And the checker in this case is that external assessor. Did they follow our methodology? Did they adhere to the handbook that has been posted in the chat? And if everything is clean, and there's always a dialogue between the external assessor and that QA analyst at HITRUST, if everything's clean, it goes on to the next step. But if it's not clean, if we identify issues with the testing methodology, we actually take that assessment out of our normal QA process and we bring it up into what we call escalated QA. And we dive deep into that assessment. And if it does not turn out that the assessment was done the way it was supposed to be done, it doesn't get certified. There's really no recourse from that point. Like, it just does not get certified. And that's never a fun conversation with the end customer that their external assessor may have messed up or whatever those circumstances may be. Sometimes it was just a lack of detail in what was submitted by the external assessor. They're able to provide that detail, and that assessment comes back into the normal QA process and moves on. I think in 2021, we had an 11% escalated QA rate on all assessments. In 2024, I think it's just over 1%. So we actually are doing a good job of training our community on how to perform, at least from a HITRUST perspective, a quality assessment. So the fact that escalated QA numbers are going down means that we have a good feedback loop with our external assessors to make sure that those assessments are being done in the right manner. In 2023, our QA analysts spent over 14,500 hours performing reviews of assessments. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of time on these assessments. We also, and I was pleased to see this in our report, our QA analysts on average spent about 85 hours in their own personal training to continue to sharpen their skills. Anyway, I digress on that. The next step is, well, we haven't even certified them at this point. If it passes our quality assurance review, it goes to our compliance team. And our compliance team is checking the checkers who check the checkers, right? So the checkers are the external assessors. The checkers checking the checkers is the quality analyst, and they're the checkers checking the quality analyst. So right there, we've had countless sets of eyeballs looking at that assessment. And we do this for every single assessment. If you see a certified HITRUST report, it went through this process. And I want to make sure, all right, it is on this slide. So that's the 6 levels of quality assurance. And we actually go further than that. And this is where the plus comes in. Our compliance team actually will go back on a quarterly basis and dig deeper into these assessments and make sure that our quality assurance team is doing their job. And what we found in 2024 is that 95% of the QA work was found to be without error. Now, sure, it'd be great for it to be 100, but the fact that we have this feedback loop, and we're all humans, so sometimes things are overlooked or mistakes are made, but we're on the high end of that percentage, I think speaks volumes to the way that we built a comprehensive program to provide that feedback loop and ensure that the quality is there. All right, the last layer is we have a quality advisory committee at our board level, and they're charged with making sure that our quality program is functional and is providing value. So sometimes they sample reports, sometimes they're just giving guidance, maybe they're making changes to the way that the quality process runs, but we have board level visibility onto the quality process. I like it. I think the more eyes you can get on the assessments, the better. Improves the outcomes, improves the reliability. So I'm coming to a close here. I know I probably talked a little bit longer than I should have, and I think there's a few questions in the chat. To me, it boils down to 2 things. The relevancy of our controls. We're following the threat actors or the malicious actors and threat data. They're telling us where to look and what's important. And then between our assessment methodology and then the QA that we run on the assessments, the reliability of our process, that's where this data point that candidly, when we released it in 2024, it was 0.64%. So we've actually trended down in the last year. I went back to my assurance team and I said, you guys need to go redo this math because there's no way that we're less than 1% compared to the rest of the industry. But here we are 2 years in a row. The data is the data. This always begs the question, well, is everybody reporting to you? Very fair question, but let me tell you a couple of things that go into that reporting requirement. One, we contractually obligate all of our customers to report incidents to us. Two, we're monitoring open source information. So if there's a breach, we're monitoring that and we will proactively reach out to the customer to ascertain the nature of the incident or breach or whatever it may be and determine whether action needs to be taken. Maybe there's something that needs to change within our controls library, whatever the outcome is, that's a part of the process. But we also require our external assessors, whenever they do an assessment, they have to verify that there hasn't been any incidents in the environment prior to that assessment being recertified. So we have a lot of ways of identifying incidents and or breaches. Is it perfect? I don't think anything's perfect, but let's say we even had a margin of error of 15%, which I think would be really, really high. We'd still be well below that industry average of 40 to 60% breaches in the last 12 months.